Thank you so much, Kim. Super excited to be here, and thank you everybody for for attending FutureCon Seattle. Super excited to have you all here. I've got an amazing group of panelists here today, and we've got some really interesting topics to talk about. We're going to talk, a little bit about budgets. Obviously it's something that we all have to deal with every single day, and we're also going to talk about ransomware, which is top of mind and a topic that is very, very relevant and timely today. So with that, I'd like to introduce our very first guest, Brian Grayek. Over to you to introduce yourself, and then we'll go, introduce Jonathan Kimmitt, and finally we'll wrap it up with our keynote speaker for the day, William Lidster. So over to you, Brian.
Hey, thanks a lot, DJ. So I've got about 40 years of experience in security. Been doing it, since college, and have loved the industry and what I've learned. Spent 10 years with Motorola. I was a vice president at Computer Associates, the 7th largest software company in the world. Ran the security division for 5 years. I've worked with a number of other companies, including Verizon. I spent 5 years with Verizon. But the thing that I love most is bringing up that next generation of security professionals. So that's why I enjoy being a part of panels like this and helping spread the wisdom. So thanks for having me, DJ.
Thank you, Brian. Over to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you, DJ. I'm Jonathan Kimmitt. I'm CISO of the University of Tulsa here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I've been CISO for 7 or so years, but I came up through the ranks from the help desk side and then the computer security response team side. So as I moved up, I took over the team and then became, CISO and, kind of where I'm at now. Primarily, I take care of most of the cybersecurity for the University of Tulsa from the network side, the desktop side, but I also do the data security side, so the data security and the privacy side, whether we're talking about privacy compliances or just privacy for confidential information. And I think that when we talk about security and we talk about privacy, what we're talking about is protecting people. Many, many years ago and other jobs, I had an opportunity to be a public servant, a law enforcement officer, and that, I kind of took that with me as I went into the help desk and I started providing services to users. But even in security, our job is to protect people and our job is to protect their information. So that I take that to heart, and that's why I like doing these. What Brian said is we come here, we engage, we talk about topics, but we do it to help others, help other organizations, help new upcoming security professionals, or even, tried and true professionals. We can always learn more and get more knowledge and get more experience.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree more with you, Jonathan. Thank you so much for that introduction. Welcome to the panel. And over to you, William.
Yeah, hi. My introduction is going to be brief because I was introduced about an hour and a half ago for the keynote. So, William Lidster, thanks for bringing me on to this panel. Just one thing to note, the University of Tulsa and something Brian said about bringing up the next generation of security professionals. I have had the great opportunity in the last year and a half to also be an adjunct part-time professor in the evening at University of Washington and Penn State for cybersecurity and computer science. And so that is a passion. And it's because I'm getting ready to retire someday, and I need some really good professionals to take over the reins and move the ship forward. So thank you very much, DJ, for bringing the introduction this way.
Absolutely. And again, thank you all. Amazing set of experienced folks over here that, and I truly appreciate the passion with which each and every single one of you operate. And thank you for being here. Very brief introduction on my part, just to wrap things up here. I'm co-founder, CEO of Armorblox. I'm your classic cliched immigrant, and I came to this country about 15 years ago. $800 in my pocket, dreams of conquering the world. And I got a PhD in computer engineering, and got DARPA and DoD to fund my dissertation, and spent some time with the military, working for the Department of Defense, and working on a lot of interesting projects, a lot of which I cannot talk about. But suffice it to say that I got the opportunity to work with bleeding edge technologies, which is absolutely fascinating. And over the years, security has become, almost the natural progression for the type of work that I've done. And seeing what we're seeing, having started at least 2 companies at this point in the security space, have discovered that there is an increasing amount of awareness in terms of what needs to be done when it comes to security, but somehow it's not nearly enough. And I hope, with this panel, we're able to get to the bottom of some of these things. And for the show today, I'll be your panel moderator. And again, thank you everybody here. With that, I'd like to kick off our first topic of conversation today. And perhaps this would be a great conversation to first go to Brian. Having been in the corporate world, Brian, I think the topic of the conversation to kick this off is about, a lot of times when we, report to the board, we have to talk about budgets, right? And it's, really interesting how, the expectation is for budgets to, stay the same for supporting functions as opposed to the budgets for, from a revenue perspective. People expect the marketing budgets to go up, but they expect the security budgets to stay the same or decrease in sometimes. And what are your thoughts on budgets even staying the same? To be very frank, I'd love to get your perspectives on it.
Absolutely, well, I'd love to. From my own knowledge, anyways, is that what I've seen is companies that are the most progressive, the companies that are going to make it, understand the security's got to be built in at the beginning. They have a CISO, brought in within the first 10, 15 employees. They have built their product with security architecture in mind. Those are the companies that I see, anyways, that are going to make it. And I've been around at least, 600-700 companies from startup all the way up through, being, Fortune 100. So, like I said, I think that when you really look at a company that's going to make it, you see that they're going to invest in security, because those companies that don't, we see them fall by the wayside. And I mean, I can't believe how many don't make it to the news. But that's, I think, one of the things that's really lacking out there is that we need to publicize more about the companies that get breached and then are gone in a week. And we don't hear that, so we don't think that it happens. But those companies that do spend the money, that they do build in protection, they do build in security into their products, those are the ones that continue to stay. So if you're a member of a board and you're not putting money into the company, then you're throwing money out the window, or you just might as well just burn it, because it's not going to last.
That's awesome. No, I think the way you're looking at this is, year over year, you should, see that investment consistently increase, just like,
Absolutely.
It cannot stay the same. That, that's awesome to hear. William, over to you. Curious what your thoughts are on the opposing forces of increasing budgets.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a responsibility for information security professionals, right, the CISO and all, to be able to be an effective communicator of risk, of implications for not addressing a particular risk area or a particular threat. And it's the responsibility of the board to run the organization. So I think there's two hats. I think as a profession, because we've all sat around like, oh, we need to learn the business of the language, or the language of the business, and we need a seat at the table. As a profession, we need to make sure we're doing that, not keep talking about it, but actually be able to do that. Become a trusted advisor to the people who are making decisions. And then at the same time, understand that, and it kind of goes to my keynote, the business is taking more risk now, okay? We talk about the venture to the cloud. We talk about the venture to software as a service. We talk about ventures for remote work. They are taking more risk. So I think we're seeing organizations become more risk acceptant, and we as a profession either have to get on board and understand that they're making the decision on what risk, or be better communicators that the risk that they're accepting is not tolerable. So I think it's two-way.
That's that makes a ton of sense, right? I think the challenge a lot of times in that communication, becomes, it gets flipped around into, hey, how does this change my top line? And when it comes to public and private institutions, they're already operating with, and then especially educational institutions, they're operating with very limited amount of resources. So, Jonathan, how have you navigated this, and what is your advice in terms of managing budgets for educational institutions when it comes to prioritizing what's important and what's not?
Well, I think that there's an assumption that we have budgets. period. I mean, I think that's one of the big issues that I see, not only from a higher ed perspective, but also small to medium business. I know a lot of organizations here in Oklahoma and around that they don't have budgets. They don't have budgets for IT. They don't have budgets for security, much less budgets for privacy, and you need to have all those three things. So a lot of things that we deal with every day, you're talking about, budgets haven't increased. Yes, and in some cases, budgets have decreased. And when organizations don't have budgets or the budgets have decreased because they've lost funding, they've lost revenue, they've lost customers, think about what's happened during the pandemic. Honestly, when we talk about, they're more accepting of risk, in some cases, they have no choice. They don't have the money to implement the new technologies. They don't have the money to implement the new security controls. They don't have the money to even hire a CISO or a third-party vendor to come in and act as a CISO. So, I think one of the things that's really beneficial to small to medium business, institutions like myself, private higher ed, are those things that kind of, and I don't want to say it like this, but force our hand into things. So you look at CMMC, you look at cyber insurance, you look at contracts, all of those things kind of forces smaller organizations to meet a certain level of requirements. And at that point, when you have to meet that, because the CMMC, if you want to get federal grants and you have to do that, it says, okay, you have to reprioritize away from this other thing over to cybersecurity. Or you start thinking about privacy regulations that are coming down, whether it be in California or Virginia or any of them. Those are new requirements that it's really hard to ignore them. When you have a choice, to say, okay, I'm not going to implement this new technology that may be more secure because I can't make payroll this year. I can't make payroll this month. And I have seen organizations that they literally had that decision. I can't implement Office 365 because if I do, I won't make payroll this month. That's really hard for organizations. That's really hard to make that decision. And honestly, the business decision comes out on that. Well, I've got to pay my people. Now, what that means is, we have to go back to fundamentals, fundamental security controls, fundamental decisions, fundamental policies and procedures, because if you start going back to those fundamentals and you can improve those, even though you may not have the money, if you can improve your fundamentals, if you can implement multi-factor, if you can do network segmentation, you can reduce, do data minimization. Sometimes you can reduce your risk that way. Implementing security controls is a way to reduce risk, but so can reducing your scope. If you can reduce scope and your risk that way, it's still a win, but you haven't paid for anything extra. So I think it really comes down for small to medium business, higher education, even K through 12. It's not a matter of budgets because we don't have any. It's a matter of let's try to get really good at fundamentals. Let's get the support from leadership and to make them understand that I don't need a $300,000 solution.
Right.
But I really need this policy and procedure to help me support this.
No, it's, I think you hit it on the head there, Jonathan. I think, the conversations that I've had with a lot of the state and local governments and in higher education, it definitely resonates. It definitely rings a bell. And the challenge is this, and which sort of brings me to that second part of that, same topic is when you mentioned that it is about educating the stakeholders, or the decision makers in some sense to be able to say, hey, listen, we recognize as security practitioners, we recognize that the business needs, or rather the needs of the business, security is woven tightly into those needs of that business. So I know William mentioned speaking the language of the business itself. What are your go-to tips? Maybe we'll start with William over here to say how being able to say when we say speaking the language, are there top 3 things that you say that helps the business recognize this?
So I learned early on to make sure I got rid of quantitative discussions of cost per record and stuff like that, because when you actually looked at it, you'd have to say if we had a breach of our entire customer database, we're out of business, and yet we're not. It's like this is going to be a $135 million breach, and it's it's not, and it's not going to get anywhere. I worked a little bit more on the emotional thing with the board and all. I talk more emotion. I talk about corporate image. I talk about corporate responsibility. I talk about brand, and it's qualitative, and it's not, but and again, you're making sure that you're talking the language of the business. I remember when the first time I was brought on board at AAA, I had my meeting with the CEO, and I said, I get 499. And he goes, what's that? I said, until I get my feet on board, if the breach is 499 or less, I keep my job, because we don't go public. We don't have to go public for it, right? And we can handle 499 people individually. And he laughed, and yet he understood. Like, not all breaches are created equal. And so when we talk and we talk about budget, we talk about risk, and we talk about things, and not everything's with the board. I'm talking about with the business, my colleagues. They have to be on board too. We talk about qualitative things that are kind of subjective, kind of emotional, and when you really understand what's important to the business, and brand is everything for us. Really it is, and it probably is for everybody, but it's sort of like, that's all we got. We're trusted.
Right.
And we're passed down from generation to generation. And so when you can put it in that kind of context, and that also means being very reasonable when they're accepting risk that you don't necessarily agree with, but you can manage. I mean, if you're always, the sky's going to fall, you're going to lose all, credibility with the people. If you're, I get asked all the time, can we do something? And if I can say yes, man, that's the first thing I'll say. It might be a yes if. I hate to go to the no but or no because, So I think if you can have that, you can be very, very pragmatic. I think you get that credibility, and you have a better conversation.
That's amazing. No, William, that was spot on, and it's a contrarian perspective to walk away from the quantitative, right? It's overused, and a lot of times people's eyes just glaze over when you just give them the numbers, and going for the emotion. That is, having an emotional approach to this is definitely, a very, very astute way of looking at things. That makes a ton of sense to me. Brian, over to you. What are your tips in terms of attacking that emotion and evoking that emotion from the board?
I've had to report up to quite a number of different boards before, and I think that there's really two parts to my answer. And one is that you've got to reduce it down to, it's not money, it's a matter of investment. And one of those that we do, anyways, I'm currently the virtual CISO with Cosant Security. Our CEO came up with an incredibly great idea, and that was the idea of a fractional CISO. So what you're able to do then is to be a CISO for 12, 14 different companies. So I spread my time across many different companies, helping a lot of different companies become CMM certified, like what Jonathan was talking about. But I also act as a CISO for those companies in giving them the kind of expertise that they would expect from a full-time CISO. So they're able to spend a fraction of the money and then get that kind of knowledge base that they need to until they can afford to get to that point to where they can afford a regular CISO. Second part of my answer is that you don't have to do everything that is in like NIST, SP 800-171 or even 53. One of the things that we learned was we actually took a matrix of the CMMC controls and mapped them across the vectors of attack. And it was amazing to me. It was like a shot across the bow of, my favorite ship, that the attack vectors weren't being handled by the controls. So what we do is, one of the first things we like to do with most customers is we go in with a risk assessment, and we'll tell them, here are your risks. I don't care about what the controls say. I don't care about what NIST or CMMC or anybody else says. These are the things that we can attack, low-hanging fruit. Think of it like, low-hanging, cherries off the tree, whatever. These are the things that you can do to reduce your overall risk, spend a little bit of money. And just like what Jonathan was talking about before, maybe it's multi-factor authentication. If you're not using, at least two-factor for finance and for your admins, then you're missing the boat. There's all sorts of because we have so many years. I mean, look at how many years of experience we have on this panel here. We know the quickest and best and fastest ways of being able to become secure. So that's one of the things that I say to most of the boards is learn how to spend your money smartly. And one of those is by getting a professional on board that can at least help you to make those kind of decisions about where you should be spending your money for your best bang. So.
No, it's awesome. No, Brian, that's it's super insightful. Fractional CISOs is definitely a very smart approach, and being able to sort of have that breadth of knowledge that and you get a much broader view of what's going on as well. But then combining that with a very clear approach of saying, hey, here's how I'm going to look at it from the lens of the business, and now that speaks to the audience immediately, as opposed to just talking about arcane standards. It's about taking those, extracting the best part of that, and saying this is how it matters to your business. Now that makes a ton of sense. I really appreciate that. Just a quick sidebar for the viewers. I know that we're starting to see the questions come in. I do want to throw it to Jonathan here before I start passing some of the questions along to the panelists here. But please keep your questions coming in, and we're capturing them in our chat panel. But over to you, Jonathan. In terms of one quick addendum that I had for you here was when you're talking about higher educational institutions and even like state and local governments that are bodies of organizations that are managed by governmental organizations, the conversation switches to obviously the universities care about their brand, like William mentioned earlier, but they also when you start thinking about state and local governments that don't have the budgets to be able to pull this off, it suddenly starts to take the flavor of a national security issue, because when you start seeing these things, the types of attacks that start to come into our local cities, it's no longer about looking good, right? It's more about hey, wait a minute, we now have a gaping hole that can potentially affect critical infrastructure inside of the country.
Well, it's a life safety issue. In a lot of cases, it's a life safety. One of the things, even here at the university, I had this conversation years ago with a senior network engineer who wanted to take our network down for a few days for upgrades. And I had to explain to him that all of our fire alarms are going off of the network. All of our emergency services are on the network. Taking something down could actually cause harm to individuals. It could cause harm to their life safety. So that is a huge, change in the mentality. Think about what's happened over the last 10 years. We have so many IoT devices, so many systems that have gone online for reporting, for alerting. They go down. It's not just so much that the internet is down. It's that we can't contact the fire department anymore. That's a problem. That's a real problem. So when you talk about, state and local governments, you talk about organizations that have people in them. I think the very first question has to be asked is anybody going to be harmed by this? When we're doing a risk assessment of any kind, of any sort of incident. In fact, when I teach incident response, that's the first thing I say. First and foremost is life safety. Is anybody going to get hurt? And when you can say no, then you can go on to the next phase of the risk assessment of the incident response. But until you can say no, that should be your first priority. And I think a lot of organizations, a lot of state and local governments, a lot of hospitals, a lot of emergency responders, a lot of law enforcement, that should be the very first thing they think about. And actually, that should be the very first thing that's in any sort of budget request, any sort of risk assessment, is anything that deals with people and their ability to live. And I know that sounds kind of funny when you say it, but I think it's really important for people to think about that. And I'll tell you, when I'm talking to a board, when I'm talking to organizations, when I'm talking to leadership, when you bring that one up, their eyes go, oh, wait a minute. What do you mean if our network goes down that people could die? Well, let's talk about it. If I were to ask, the audience, or ask, when I do presentation, I always ask, has anyone ever died because of a data breach? Well, the answer is, Yes. I mean, there have been cases where people have been accredited, their death has been accredited to a data breach. Now, we can talk about that more some other time, but a lot of people don't think about that. They go, oh, really? I didn't know that was even possible. Has anybody ever died because of ransomware? Yes, we had one last year. So, I mean, this is something now, and I'll ask ask kind of everyone, how many people have gone into IT and gone into IT security because they liked dealing with people? But now all of our systems is about dealing with life safety, is dealing with people, dealing with services to people. So I think that really comes down to when you're talking about a small to medium business, a higher education, K through 12, any of those, when you're talking to leadership, first and foremost, you need to talk about, the protections of people. Right. And that will help you do other things. But if you have that in your head, that's what you're focused on, at least first, and then you start expanding it out, I think it allows people to really understand the scale that you're dealing with.
No, I think that's really good advice there, Jonathan. I think a part of it is almost a shock and awe approach, right? Especially if the audio is not being heard, to the board, to the leadership. You got to start with something that grabs their attention a little bit, saying, "Hey, listen, you're not taking this nearly seriously enough, and this is very important." And once you have their attention, you could break it down and say, "Okay, here's how you think about it," and giving them the appropriate frameworks to be able to then process, from whether it's budgets or decisions or priorities. It gives them the ability to work on those. No, that's definitely something that it's an approach that we've seen work. And thanks for bringing that up. All right, so we've got a few questions here. I'm going to use a little bit of segue here to discuss those, and then dive back before we dive into our second topic. The first one is from Philip M. And the question is, are there any resources for SMBs for helping their overworked teams drive the conversations? And breaking down this, does it affect you? Now, this is the, and basically, it says that how do you do this for SMBs where it's not the, I think it's a trade-off between the long-term cost versus the immediate cost. How do you sort of, work through that? Especially when you don't have constraints by like California laws, right? A lot of times GDPR and CCP impose certain things and force you to, for the lack of a better term, behave better as a business. But in the absence of those types of laws or regulatory requirements, how do you help SMBs? And perhaps Jonathan, you want to kick us off, and then we'll go around the room.
A lot of it comes down to risk management, of course. So cyber insurance is a huge one if you have it, and a lot of organizations don't, whether it's cyber insurance or just organizational insurance. You also have regulatory bodies that can help with some of that. Whether or not you fall under like California law or, GDPR, you probably fall under, state laws for how you treat consumers, fall under the FTC, the SEC, depending on what you do. So you might fall under other regulatory bodies that's not one of these that you can use to your advantage. But the other side of it is industry. You need to take advantage of the industry. It's, they talked about, helping small and medium business if they're overworked teams. Yes, and it's not going to get easier. It truly isn't. But take advantage of the industry to help. Professional groups, things like ISSA, or, start getting contacts where you can get someone that might be able to say, hey, this product is a good product, you should deploy, or this process is a good training, conferences, these sort of FutureCon. I mean, engaging in something like this allows you to get, I'm not going to claim I'm an expert, but you get other people on this call that are experts, that are great to get information from. And you can take these little tidbits and go back to your small to medium business, and maybe you can implement that. And you can show us like, hey, listen to what, DJ said or what Brian said, here's a recording. This is really good stuff. We should be doing this. I think that that's what really helps that small to medium business, is because if they're self-contained, they don't know what the industry is doing or what the world is doing, then they can't really implement things to make things better. Even free things, cheap things, they just don't know. So get out there, talk with people, engage, learn what's happening and what you can do for your environment.
That makes a ton of sense. Brian, your thoughts?
Yeah, in addition, there's a lot of free things out there. But one of the things that I like telling people about is that there's a lot of funding out there that people are not aware of. Local Chamber of Commerce's, state funding, federal funding, especially if you're doing any kind of federal contracts and things. So there's money out there that they're trying to give away that people aren't applying for. So, if you're running a business, God's sakes, get out there and look to see what money's available. Second, this is one of the areas that really flips people on their head, which is that look at security as being an investment in sales. Now, just think about that for a second. I have a lot of customers that will publicize the fact that they are certified in such and such in order to be able to show their customers that we value your security more, your product is safer with us, your services will be better done by us. So those companies are investing in their company by increasing their security or getting those certifications. And I have a half a dozen customers that have put on their web pages about their rights of trust. So their trust page is what they call it. And they'll say on there that because we value your business, we are spending money to make ourselves more secure, to keep your data more secure. So look at it as an investment in sales and generating revenue. So.
I'll say that I will not, from the university perspective, I will not do business with a company that does not have professionally trained security staff. If they don't have professionally trained security staff, I will not enter a contract with them. I will not do a vendor relationship with them. And that's pre-contract. I ask them straight up. I send them an email. I was like, do you have this? Do you have this? And if they don't have it, I don't do business with them, just flat out. So, I'm kind of on the other side. I'm the consumer here on this case. But I ask that question. I check that. And I encourage everybody to ask that same question.
That's
and I gotta tap in on that one, because I cannot believe how many companies that you would expect that they have a security professional, that you would expect that they have a CISO. I worked with one company that had just gotten breached, and I walked in and said, where's your CISO? We don't have one. Well, where's your director of security? Don't have one. Can I talk to your CIO? At least this guy got to know something about security. And I found out they had no firewall. Now, any security professional out there would go, what in the world are you doing running a professional Fortune 500 company without a firewall? And you would call them crazy. But this guy thought that he could do all of it through ACLs and routing. I don't need a firewall. That's the kind of people that are out there. So when you think that when you're dealing with a company, I don't care if it's a security company, ask them that very question Jonathan just posed. Do you have security professionals on staff? Do you have a CISO? Do you have a director of security? Those kind of questions. You might think they're dumb. You'll find out they're not.
That's a great point. Thank you. William, beyond pointing people from a resource perspective to your keynote speech that just happened, what other resources would you recommend? Because I know you had amazing tips. You had like the top 5 tips to, for people to start prioritizing and thinking about, is that, how would you guide somebody that comes in and says, my staff is overworked, my staff has barely the resources, but how can I impress upon, this to my, to my team members? How can I alleviate that? What would your suggestions be for them?
Yeah, that's definitely Philip's question, right? We're overworked, and I'm having a hard time communicating that more resources are important.
Right.
When I used to do what Brian did part-time for local healthcare. I was for their virtual CISO, and they were not getting a lot of support from the board. And what we did is we decided to approach this again from the business. And for Philip, I'm trying to get there. It won't be a long preamble. So the risk assessment, but the risk assessment had to be meaningful. And so we found out what the risk management goals were for the organization, what mattered to them. Right, and it was a patient care kind of place, so it was all about we have to have a great reputation in the community. Right, we can't get overrun by regulators from a big HIPAA high-tech breach. Right, and we want to not have like sentinel events. That was the extreme. Right, and then what we did is when we did their IT risk assessment, we mapped it to those kind of impacts. right? And probabilities. And the probabilities get fuzzy, but at least we're able to do to those impacts. And that was how we communicated. And it sort of goes back, to the early thing. Someone's going to die. And we didn't get that extreme, but how about, we have impacted patient care. We've given someone the wrong medication. We've done whatever that might be, right? Because we had extremes on those three areas. And I think if you can do that, and it always goes back to the business, it goes back to the emotional, it goes back to, the regulators are going to take over your business. That's horrific. They'll make, but it's emotional. Someone's going to have a sentinel event. That's emotional. You'll have a bad reputation in the community. That's emotional. And so I think if you can do that and put together your risk and communicate that, that's your resources, your risk matrix, and then the risk. And again, you can't be FUD. You can't make everything the worst thing in the world, or else you lose all credibility. But if you can do those things, those low-hanging fruits, the things that are the most important, that's what I think the resource is. And then if the organization still says, we don't care, I kind of got nothing at that point, kind of thing. Like that is how the organization is going to operate. And I don't have much after that.
That's a very fair statement. And in fact, a lot of it does depend on how the business sort of sees these things when you do present this information, and if they're making a rational choice or not. And if they're not making a rational choice, you exit, you find the door. And there are plenty of other opportunities where businesses do recognize the importance of what needs to be done, and you are better, your time is better spent, working for those. So, it's also a competitive advantage, like was mentioned. It's a sales advantage from a revenue perspective. It is a recruiting advantage from hiring top talent to come and work at your, at your business, because if you cannot, if you do not recognize the value of what it brings to the business, once the case is being made, then you're going to have a very tough time recruiting top talent to come in and help out from a security perspective. So, those are excellent points over there. I've got another question here from a Michael M. The conversation seems to go in an interesting direction. He said, he still has a feeling that that prevention is more costly than breach mitigation. Perhaps the best investment is in recovery as opposed to trying to prevent it. Now, he makes a good point. He says that when lives are at risk, it's a different calculus, but it seems that assets and reputation really are not particularly impacted, and in which case is recovery better? I'll throw it off to Jonathan. I can see a reaction already, but I'd love to get your thoughts on it.
I certainly know where they're coming from. We're going to talk about ransomware in just a minute. That whole idea of prevention versus containment versus recovery. I understand. But here's the deal. There's one thing that people don't really think about is there's a certain amount of liability in the decision makers. So if an organization or even an individual decision maker says, I'm not going to worry about preventing, I'm just going to worry about recovery, they are accepting that risk personally. There is litigation. There are laws out there. In some cases, you look at HIPAA, where you can be charged criminally for decisions that you make that led to the harm of individuals. You look at the Yates memo that talks about the Department of Justice is going to go after the individuals for corporate wrongdoing, not just the corporation, the organization, it's the individuals. So I strongly discourage any IT or any IT security decision maker to not think about everything you can do to prevent it. Now, can you prevent everything? No, you just can't. You try to get as much as you can. You try to contain as much as you can, and you try to recover as best you can. You do your best. But you always have to think about is if you make a decision and there's a judge or a jury that has to make a determination on whether that decision was reasonable, most common sense will go, yeah, that's probably not reasonable. We're not going to implement MFA because that's too hard. If we get breached, we'll just deal with it. Well, most of the industry, most of the world is going to look at that and go, that's not a good idea. That was a bad decision. And there could be charges. There could be civil. There could be criminal. There could be a lot of things. I don't encourage people to have that thought in any way. I understand it. I know why. It's just, I think it's a bad idea.
And just to add to that, it's popular culture right now to sort of think about the fact that you should already operate from a perspective of having been compromised, right? The notion of zero trust, it basically says assume that you're compromised, which forces people more onto that recovery mindset than to invest heavily on prevention, because people are saying, hey, listen, man, I could pay the difference between $1 million of investment and a $10 million investment in my in prevention, versus it's really, the outcome ends up being the same. Like when I look at those two things, because I am going to find myself in I am going to get compromised. I have to operate with the notion that I am going to get compromised. So I think there's a little bit of too much of that going on that causes people to start imagining that, okay, if that is the case, let me spend $500,000 on prevention and buy insurance policy towards the recovery side of the house. So,
I would say though, I mean, insurance companies, there's a lot of insurance companies are getting out of cybersecurity because people had that mindset. They are not providing it. In fact, now if you're doing applications for a lot of the cyber insurances, they're asking much more detailed questions. They are wanting to make sure that your security program is much, much better than it was even a year ago. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think that there's an expectation that, the risk transference over to insurance has been a common thing for many, many years. And I understand it, but the insurance companies don't like that. They don't want that. They're there for a very particular purpose, but they're going to start asking more and more questions to say, well, wait a minute. Do you have multi-factor everywhere? Do you have backups? Do you have this? And if you don't, especially if you say you do, that's a bad day. That they're not going to cover you, and you're still going to pay out that premium. You're still going to pay out. It's a bad idea. Now, I understand the balance of, how much will you pay to repair your car versus buying a new car? I mean, that's normal. And we all kind of think about that. I don't think it really pertains to cybersecurity because we don't know what that ransomware is going to cost or what the ramifications are going to be, what breach notifications you're going to have to do. It's not just the ransomware cost. It's all that other time. So you can't start comparing that, and you just don't know. If you put that ounce of prevention in, maybe you can mitigate that pound of risk. It all depends on the situation.
That's fair. No, that's very fair. I see William smiling because I know we're talking insurance, AAA right up his alley. Over to you, William. What are your thoughts over there?
No, actually, because this particular question from our audience member came right off my keynote, in which I suggested that if it's not a matter of if but when, we are banging our head against the prevention of the if, and we're not doing a really good job on the when. And I was just looking at, breaches and the growth in breaches over time. We're looking at all of our security solutions. And so, it's, you need to do due diligence. You need to do good practices. Even in my own conversation, but do I have to do ZTA? Do I have to go from zone-based firewalling to micro-segmentation? I mean, at what point am I working and killing myself so much? And so, and I think rapid detection and rapid response capabilities is a risk mitigator, right? Because we know what happens when you can rapidly detect and get them out before there's actually real exfiltration or anything like that. So, no, I'm definitely not a advocate of, throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's just not it. And I just renewed our own cybersecurity thing yesterday. Matter of fact, we just finished the application, and there were a lot more questions. There were a lot more, but I have to admit, what they're asking me that I had for controls were extremely reasonable.
Oh, yeah.
Foundational, right? So we should do foundational controls. We should be fundamentally sound. We should do best practices. I'm just not sure that everything that we're being driven to do is the best practice in terms of prevention, right? And I say we stop getting driven that way. So I appreciate the question, and I think sometimes the juice isn't worth the squeeze. But going back to what you said, I wouldn't be the person that made that decision by myself. You know what I mean? Have allies, have the business, have business leadership, understanding, agreeing put it in a memorandum for record that this is kind of our thing that we're not going to deal with. We accept the risk because we can't, whatever our response is. But no, we don't start prevention all the way. We have a responsibility to do that. But boy, we should be looking more at our detection response too. There's no doubt about that.
Thank you, William. I agree. I couldn't agree more. A lot of times, some of these, to Brian and Jonathan's earlier points as well, it falls down to the basics, right? And then I've got an interesting question that comes up right after this from a Matt M. But before I tee that up, Brian, investing in basics, what are your thoughts on that? 9 out of 10 ransomware attacks start out as an email recon attack. And it doesn't require fancy, stuff there. It's about, emails is as basic as it gets, how do you make, when you think about controls for emails, the second largest peer-to-peer protocol after DNS, SMTP, emails flow in, emails flow out all the time. And that's how every single company and every single people here, we do business by communicating emails outside of our own organizations. How do you solve for that? How do you focus on the basics for something as simple as emails?
Very easy, quite easy, in fact. Well, just to bring up one point, I don't know if everybody knows it or not, but the Colonial Pipeline, that was they breached it by email. Now, guess how old their email was? 5 years old. To me, that's criminal. If a company especially if a public company, one that you're providing public services, water, electricity, something like that. If you get breached and you've got something that's that bad, you should be criminally prosecuted, period. That's all there is to it. Because those kind of things are just absolutely ridiculous. So let's go back to my earlier point, which I was saying that when my company goes in and does a risk assessment, we're not going in and looking at 152 controls. We're looking at the normal ways that people are being breached, the quickest and most fastest things you can do for your money, and the best ways you could be able to lower your risk posture. So what we have found is the same thing that the Verizon Security Report comes out with every year. Every year, if you read that report, this is the same thing. Do these 10 things, and you're going to reduce 95% of the breaches. But it's always the same 10 things. Why? Because we're not doing them. Administrative controls, don't allow people to have administrative controls unless they need them. Force the people to use multi-factor authentication. Jonathan, you brought that up a number of times. I can't believe how many times I'll go in and do a presentation for a company and I'll ask, how many people have multi-factor authentication? And it's always, what? What's So it's the simple little things like that can, like Jonathan said, they're extremely cost effective, they're extremely inexpensive to do, but yet people aren't doing it. I understand the whole idea with vulnerabilities. There's more patches coming out, there's thousands of vulnerabilities being issued every day, we can't keep up with it and whatever. But when you've got something as ubiquitous as email, like you said, DJ, it's ridiculous that a company let their email get 5 years old without patching it. So you want to look at the most important vectors you have for attack, which are email, your network, your data systems. These kind of things, you look at those and you say, okay, how can a person breach me? Then I look at protecting those. I don't look at, all these weird little, advanced threat diagrams that people are putting out there. And I don't look at persistent threats and whatever. If they want you, they're going to get you. But if I can do those 5 or 10 things, that's where we help companies say, these are the things you should do. And this is where you get your biggest bang for your buck. And unfortunately, again, companies just aren't doing the basics. So how do we force them to do those basics? I don't know.
Which brings me to it's a fun question. I'm going to stick a pin. I'm going to come back to it in a second here. I've got a rapid fire question for each one of you. This is a question from Matt M. And you got to pick one or the other. What keeps you up at night? Ransomware or budget issues? Jonathan, first you.
Ransomware.
Ransomware. Brian.
Yeah, ransomware. Out of doubt.
William.
Ransomware.
Perfect. All right, we've got the trifecta. It is it's exactly like the American Idol situation. Everybody marks it. Big X ransomware moves on to the next round. The interesting part about ransomware, and I think we've talked about protective controls, preventive controls, and also recovery controls here. I've got a question here from Zhang Ling L. The question is: most organizations do not need to open their network to the whole world. It is absolutely not required. Why not block all non-US traffic? And if necessary, with case by case, permit ACLs by specific IPs and MACs, and work sort of a least privileged access mode. Can we not solve these types of attacks and have people come in download malware or download ransomware that causes some of these issues? So your thoughts on just managing it using ACLs? I know we've had an opinion, Jonathan, socialized that already, but perhaps we'll start with William and then go the other way. William, over to you.
The idea is really good. With the can we kind of block everything from other places in the globe? I do that. But I have to keep a website that's open because people travel all over the globe with AAA. And yet, I kind of still block Iran, North Korea, Syria, et cetera, et cetera. If you happen to be one of my members who's in Syria and can't get to my website, sorry, So
right.
Yeah, there are reasonable things you can do that are aligned with that particular question. It's not going to be a prevent all, but that's why we do layered security, right? But I believe it's very reasonable to find areas that you go, it is absolutely ridiculous that this would be a necessary service that we have to provide to some, place outside of continental U.S., whatever your service area might be. Doesn't work for everybody, but at least it's thought about, downloading and clicking links. That's a little bit harder, I think. Most of our technologies tend to categorize like websites. They might do some detonation of what's in the link before, it presents it to you. I haven't seen a lot that is strictly based off like, well, there's no reason why you would need to go to a website in Syria. I'm making an example, it seems to do more of a categorization and more of a detonation and sandboxing and double checking what's in there, which I think is actually a preferred method than, it comes from some country. I think that's going to be a limitation. And I think it's going to give you a feeling of security that's not actually there.
That's a great point about the artificial sense of security there. Over to you, Jonathan, before I hand it off to Brian on ACLs.
I'm going to say yes, you can. I mean, you absolutely can. And if you want to do the overhead on that, absolutely. I do that, kind of like what William said. I do that. And pretty much every single time I put a country on the block list, I immediately get a call from a student who says, I can't do my work. So we go in and put an exception in. I think really what I encourage organizations to do is what, Brian was talking about before. What are your actual threats? You can put in all the ACLs, you can put all the network segmentation in, you can block all the different countries. Is that your actual threats? Is that actually the threat vector coming in? I've gone to organizations where they have spent $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 on a particular security control. And when I ask them, what threat are you trying to stop? And they go, well, this is just what we put in. Like, no. What were you trying to stop? Oh, we don't know. Okay, well, you really have to think about it. It's like, what is actually happening? Can you do that? Absolutely. Should you do it? Probably. But what risk are you mitigating? What value to the business are you bringing? What return on investment are you providing? I think those are all business decisions. Those are all risk analysis and part of your risk framework of, can you do this? Yes. What's your overhead? What's your cost? And what's the value you get out of it?
I really, couldn't agree more on the overhead part of it. I installed this little tool called Little Snitch. It is it's something that goes on Mac that literally monitors every single network connection that your Mac laptop makes, both incoming and outgoing. And being a security guy myself, my initial thought was, oh, I'm going to lock down everything, right? And I locked down. I just want to open up like small sets of things. Guess what happens? I am constantly clicking on the love list. Every single app is making so many calls. You start looking at a map, it's going to an AWS data center in Zurich. I'm like, why is it going to a data center in Zurich? Oh, turns out the developer that built that application that I use, it's a simple application that puts all of my apps in a corner, like it's called a magnet. But that developer was out of Zurich, and so they use the data center over there. And like the connections going out to China, there are connections going out to a whole India, because I made a Zoom call to speak with some folks out of India. Turns out they're using local data centers, and I'm like, I'm constantly clicking on that allow button nonstop to be able to open up those ports, because the world is global, right? And a lot of times it's not just restricted to a specific pocket. But no, I'm with you on that. Brian, thoughts on how to manage that?
Well, I think you heard my my opinion on ACLs a little bit earlier here. Everything is layered approach. I mean, I used to tell people that anything you overdo, as simple as drinking too much water, can kill you. So you have to look at everything in moderacy. You have to look at everything as a layered. You have to look at everything as in where are my priorities. So the example with ACL, sure, I can kick out, 4 or 5 countries and be pretty confident that I'm not going to suffer any kind of, major kind of issues by, it's called geo-blocking is the technical term for it. And I can be pretty sure that I shouldn't have a problem if my company doesn't do, kind of international work. But here's the problem, folks. 93%, I think, according to the Verizon report, of your attacks are going to come from the United States. So guess what? If you're wanting to start putting in, if you're wanting to start to put in ACLs, then you better block everybody in the United States, because that's where 93% of your attacks are coming from. So if that's the mentality you're going to have, start blocking everybody around you. So, and again, I say that kind of farcically, but that's the truth. You're being attacked from within your own country. That's where they're taking over mom and pop's laptops. Everybody's laptops and computers at home are being infiltrated. They're dropping porn on them. They're dropping illegal contraband on them. They're dropping child, pornography with, everything that they're doing. They're getting it inside of our walls, and then they're going to use ourselves to attack each other. So no, that kind of thinking of, can I block by country? Can I block by IP? No, it just doesn't work. I've consulted to companies as big as Microsoft in my past. And one of the things that they learned was there are no walls, because all of their employees are everywhere in the world. So they had to come to this understanding of, how do I protect myself? Well, I protect myself by securing the things that are most valuable to me, like my database, like my development infrastructure. And how do you do that? You create the same thing we've been doing since the 1950s. You create perimeters around each little alcove, each little kingdom, and you layer approach of security. And you do that by understanding who is attacking you and how they're going to attack you. So again, it comes back to simple processes and the same things that were taught since grade school.
Awesome. Well, folks, we're at time. This was fantastic. We could keep talking for hours over here and have incredible amount of
great conversation.
Right,
absolutely.
Exactly. Right. Thank you so much again for your time. And this was absolutely a pleasure and an incredible honor to moderate. Back to you, Kim.